Max stood by the large windows of his luxurious apartment, overlooking the city's sprawling skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange hue across the room. In his hand, he held an elegantly designed wedding invitation, the ivory envelope sealed with a delicate gold monogram. He had received it just a few days ago, and it had been sitting on his coffee table ever since. Max kept picking it up and putting it down, as if the act of holding it would somehow make the decision easier. But it didn't. The invitation was from Evelyn, his ex-girlfriend. They had been together for nearly 3 years, and he once thought she was the one he'd spend his life with. But life had a different plan. Evelyn left him almost a year ago, accusing him of prioritizing work over their relationship. He remembered the fights, how she had expressed feeling invisible, sidelined by his ambitious goals. She wanted more, she said. She wanted time, attention, and the little gestures that showed love and care. Max, absorbed in his business ventures, hadn't realized how deeply she was hurting until the day she walked out, leaving him in an apartment filled with unspoken words and regrets. After she left, Max poured himself deeper into work. It was his way of coping, his way of avoiding the emptiness that had taken root in his chest. The days turned into months, and while he achieved professional success, the void remained, growing more noticeable during quiet moments like these. The invitation felt like a slap in the face, a tangible reminder of what he'd lost. Evelyn's handwriting on the card was so familiar, yet now it seemed distant, like a relic of another time. The news of her engagement had been shocking enough, but the thought of seeing her walk down the aisle towards someone else, it filled Max with a strange mix of sadness, anger, and bitterness. How could she move on so easily? Was it really so effortless to forget him, to forget what they had shared? Max didn't want to go. He didn't want to see her with another man, smiling the way she once smiled at him. He imagined the ceremony in vivid detail, Evelyn looking radiant, the guests exchanging whispered conversations, and his own awkward presence among them. Alone. Attending the wedding alone seemed unbearable, but not attending. It would be a different kind of pain, a lingering wound of never truly confronting the past. That evening, restless and unable to stay cooped up in his penthouse, Max decided to go for a walk. He needed fresh air, a change of scenery, something to clear his mind from the swirling emotions that the invitation had stirred up. He slipped on his jacket and left, descending from his glass and steel cocoon to the bustling streets below. As he wandered through the city, lost in thought, he hardly noticed the crowds around him. The noise of car horns, conversations, and footsteps all blended into a distant hum. He found himself drifting into an unfamiliar neighborhood, away from the towering skyscrapers and polished storefronts that usually defined his world. It was on a quieter street corner that he saw her, a woman sitting on a small piece of worn cardboard, her back against the cold stone wall of a closed shop. Her clothes were clearly old and weathered, and her hair was tangled in loose curls that framed her face. Max wouldn't have noticed her, except for her smile. She was smiling, not in a broad or flashy way, but with a calmness that seemed almost surreal given her situation. Max slowed his pace, feeling an inexplicable pull towards her. He stopped a few feet away, observing her quietly. The woman didn't seem to notice him at first, her focus resting on a crumpled paperback book in her lap. It was only when Max shifted slightly that she looked up, startled by his presence. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two strangers with nothing in common except for being in the same place at the same time. "Hi," Max said, somewhat awkwardly, not entirely sure what he was doing. It wasn't like him to start conversations with strangers, especially those in such different circumstances, but something about her presence felt grounding, even amidst his own emotional turmoil. "My name is Max." The woman hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to respond. Her eyes studied him cautiously, trying to gauge his intentions. Finally, she spoke. "Hello, I'm Lila," she said, her voice quiet but steady. There was a silence that followed, one that could have easily slipped into discomfort, but instead felt almost contemplative. Max didn't know what to say next. Should he ask her if she needed help? Offer her money? It all seemed patronizing and meaningless, especially since he had no idea what her story was. "Are you okay?" he asked, instantly regretting the vague question. What did okay even mean to someone living on the streets? Lila looked at him for a moment longer, then let out a soft laugh. Not out of mockery, but perhaps out of an understanding that words like okay had lost their meaning somewhere along her journey. "I'm all right," she replied, her smile returning. "It's not the best situation, but I'm doing what I can." Max felt a pang of guilt. He was a man who had everything: money, power, the ability to change his circumstances at will. And yet here was someone facing challenges he couldn't even begin to understand, offering a smile that carried more grace than he thought possible. What's your story?" he found himself asking, unsure of where this conversation was going, but feeling compelled to continue it. Lila didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be considering how much to reveal to a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Eventually, she began to speak, sharing bits and pieces of her life: a lost job, a series of unfortunate events, and a few wrong turns that led to where she was now. But what struck Max the most wasn't the hardships she described, but the way she spoke about them, with a kind of resilience that defied her circumstances. They talked for a while, and as the minutes passed, Max felt something shift within him. He had spent so much of the past year in a self-absorbed fog, wallowing in his own pain, that he had forgotten what it was like to connect with another person on a genuine level. Lila's presence, her honesty, and her unwavering hope despite everything, it was a stark contrast to the hollow bitterness he had been carrying around. Without fully thinking it through, Max heard himself say, "Would you like to come to a wedding with me?" Lila blinked, clearly taken aback by the absurdity of the question. "A wedding?" she echoed, as if making sure she had heard him correctly. Max nodded. "Yeah, I have an extra invitation, and I could use some company." There was a long pause as Lila processed the unexpected offer. Max couldn't quite believe he had said it himself. What was he doing inviting a complete stranger to Evelyn's wedding? But at that moment, it didn't matter. He wasn't thinking about appearances or consequences. He was simply acting on instinct. Lila seemed unsure, her cautious smile wavering as she looked at him. Finally, she asked, "Why me?" Max struggled to find the right words. "Because I don't want to go alone," he admitted. "And you seem like someone who understands more about life than I do right now." Lila considered his answer, her expression softening. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her smile returning, a little brighter this time. "I'll go." Max felt an odd sense of relief mixed with anticipation. He didn't know what the next few days would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was stepping towards something new, instead of running from something old. The day of the wedding arrived quicker than Max expected. He had promised Lila that he would pick her up early to take her to a boutique for a dress and some basic preparations. He knew that showing up at Evelyn's high-profile wedding required more than just basic attire. It required confidence and a sense of belonging, something that Lila might not have felt in a long time. Max wanted to ensure that she could walk into that event with her head held high. He pulled up in front of the old weathered shelter where Lila had agreed to meet him. The building was run down and neglected, a stark contrast to the luxury shops and high-rise apartments Max was used to. As he waited by his car, he couldn't help but feel slightly anxious. This was unfamiliar territory for him, helping someone in such a personal way and doing something that felt so impulsive. The shelter's door creaked open and Lila emerged, holding a worn duffel bag over her shoulder. She seemed tentative, but as soon as she saw Max, she straightened and offered him a small, grateful smile. She was wearing the same clothes he had seen her in before, but he could sense her nervousness beneath her outward composure. Max opened the car door for her, and she hesitated for a moment before getting in. He could tell she wasn't used to this, being driven around in luxury, having doors open for her. As he started the engine and they drove off, the silence in the car was palpable. "So," Max said, trying to ease the tension, "are you ready for this?" Lila looked at him, her expression a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for something like this," she admitted with a nervous laugh. "But I'm here, so I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be." Max nodded, feeling a strange camaraderie in her uncertainty. He wasn't sure if he was ready either. This wasn't just about attending a wedding, it was about confronting his past and maybe discovering something new about himself along the way. They arrived at an exclusive boutique, the kind that catered to an elite clientele with finely tailored suits and designer gowns. The exterior was minimalist, with large glass windows that showcased mannequins dressed in elegant, intricate attire. As they approached the entrance, Lila seemed hesitant, glancing up at the polished sign overhead and the luxurious displays behind the glass. "Are you sure this is okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "Trust me," Max replied, offering her a reassuring nod. "You're going to look amazing." He led her inside where the staff initially seemed indifferent. They were accustomed to high-paying customers, and Lila's presence didn't exactly fit their typical clientele profile. But once they realized she was with Max, their demeanor shifted. Suddenly, they were attentive, eager to cater to her every need. Max made it clear that no expense would be spared, and that Lila should be treated like a guest of honor. Lila's eyes widened as she looked around the boutique, taking in the racks of dresses, the shining mirrors, and the stylish employees moving gracefully around the store. It was a world she had never entered, and the experience was overwhelming. One of the sales assistants approached, introducing herself with a polished smile and a professional demeanor. "Good afternoon, sir. Ma'am, how can we assist you today?" the woman asked, her gaze flickering over Lila in curiosity. Max explained that they were looking for a dress for a formal wedding, and he wanted Lila to have the full experience. Hair, makeup, everything. Lila was clearly taken aback by the level of attention and service, unsure of how to respond. She had been on her own for so long that this sudden kindness and luxury felt almost unreal, like a dream that might slip away if she didn't hold on tightly enough. As the staff led Lila away to a private fitting area, Max waited outside, letting her have a moment to herself. Time seemed to stretch as he paced the room, occasionally glancing toward the fitting area with growing curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder what she would choose, how she would look, and more importantly, how she would feel in a setting so far removed from her everyday life. Lila, meanwhile, was guided through an array of beautiful dresses, each one more elegant than the last. She was hesitant at first, touching the fabric cautiously, as if afraid she might damage something so delicate. The sales assistants, sensing her uncertainty, gently encouraged her to try on different styles. Lila finally settled on a classic, floor-length gown in deep emerald green. The color complemented her warm complexion, and when she stepped out of the dressing room, she caught her reflection in the large, ornate mirror. For a moment, Lila didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The dress flowed gracefully around her, hugging her frame in all the right places. It felt strange to see herself like this, dressed in something so elegant, so far removed from the old worn clothes she usually wore. She ran her fingers over the smooth fabric, still trying to believe this was real. Max, who had been waiting nearby, looked up as Lila emerged. His breath caught for a moment, seeing her in the gown. There was a newfound confidence in the way she held herself, a spark of something that had been buried deep inside finally finding its way to the surface. "Wow," he said, unable to hide his admiration. "You look incredible." Lila blushed slightly, looking down at the dress with a shy smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "I never thought I'd wear something like this." "You deserve it," Max said, his words sincere. "You really do." The staff continued their work, styling Lila's hair and applying subtle, natural makeup that highlighted her features without masking them. As the finishing touches were applied, Lila took one last look in the mirror, feeling a sense of disbelief mingled with cautious excitement. This wasn't just about looking beautiful, it was about feeling like she belonged, if only for a little while. When they finally left the boutique, Lila was transformed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Max could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she smiled more openly, in the lightness of her steps. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, she believed she was worthy of being seen. The wedding venue was a grand estate on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by manicured gardens and tall, imposing gates. As Max and Lila arrived, the place was already bustling with guests, all dressed in their finest attire. Lila felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, but Max reached out and gave her a reassuring nod. "We're in this together," he said softly. They walked through the gates, entering the sprawling gardens where the ceremony was set to take place. The guests turned to look at them as they made their way down the path, their curious gazes lingering on Lila. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of judgment and surprise, but she held her head high, drawing strength from Max's quiet support. Even Evelyn couldn't help but notice them. She was standing near the altar, talking to some of the guests, when she saw Max and his unexpected companion approaching. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she regained her composure. She hadn't expected Max to show up with anyone, let alone someone who carried herself with such quiet grace. As the ceremony continued, Max and Lila found a spot near the back, watching from a distance. Lila felt like she was in a different world, surrounded by people who seemed so polished and perfect. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. She focused on staying present, reminding herself that she had just as much right to be here as anyone else. Throughout the evening, Lila navigated the event with a poise that surprised even herself. She made polite conversation with other guests, deflecting any judgment with a warm smile and an air of quiet confidence. Max stayed by her side, offering his silent support whenever she needed it. It wasn't long before people stopped questioning her presence and simply accepted her as part of the event. As for Evelyn, she couldn't help but watch them from a distance, her curiosity growing with each passing moment. She had known Max for years, and she could tell that something was different about him. There was a sense of calm, of acceptance, in the way he carried himself. A stark contrast to the driven, restless man she had once known. For the first time in a long time, Max felt at peace with where he was. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone or justify his choices. He was here, and he was content, and that was enough. And Lila, this remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly, was by his side, reminding him of the beauty in the simplest of connections. As the evening drew on, and the soft melodies of the wedding band filled the air, Max and Lila exchanged a quiet glance, understanding that this moment marked the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected, but both were willing to explore. The ceremony was over, and the guests had moved on to the reception area, a large, ornately decorated hall with tall windows that framed the view of the estate's gardens. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light refracting through hundreds of glass beads, casting shimmering patterns across the walls. Waitstaff, dressed in crisp uniforms, weaved seamlessly between the tables, carrying trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres and sparkling flutes of champagne. Max and Lila stood together near one of the windows, admiring the meticulously arranged flowers that adorned each table. The evening was going smoothly, and Max had hoped it would stay that way. However, he knew it was only a matter of time before Evelyn made her way over. She had been casting glances in their direction all evening, and each time, her gaze lingered a little longer. Max could sense the inevitable conversation approaching like a gathering storm, and he braced himself for it. Lila, ever perceptive, had noticed Evelyn's occasional glances as well. She turned to Max, a question forming on her lips, but stopped herself. She didn't want to pry. This was his past, and she had no right to ask, at least not yet. Instead, she offered him a small, reassuring smile, silently communicating that she was there for whatever was to come. When Evelyn finally approached, Max could almost hear the shift in the room's atmosphere. The hum of conversation seemed to quiet around them, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Evelyn was a vision in her wedding gown, a delicate lace-covered masterpiece that accentuated her slender frame and radiated a timeless elegance. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and she moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Max," she said, her voice composed but carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. "It's good to see you." Max turned to face her, offering a polite nod. "Evelyn, congratulations on your wedding." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, glancing briefly at Lila before turning her attention back to Max. "I didn't expect to see you here with company." "This is Lila," Max said, gesturing towards her. He didn't elaborate further, and Lila, sensing the tension, offered a polite smile. Evelyn's eyes lingered on Lila for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her expression. "It's nice to meet you, Lila," she said, her tone measured and practiced. "Likewise," Lila replied, her voice steady and warm. She knew she was an outsider in this world, but she refused to let that intimidate her. She held Evelyn's gaze without wavering, a quiet confidence radiating from her. Evelyn shifted slightly as if unsure how to proceed. "Max, could I speak with you alone for a moment?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Max glanced at Lila, who gave him a slight nod, indicating she was okay with it. She didn't want to be the cause of any added tension or awkwardness. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "I'll wait over there." As Lila walked towards the balcony to give them some privacy, Evelyn watched her go, her eyes narrowing slightly. Once Lila was out of earshot, Evelyn turned back to Max, her expression shifting from polite to contemplative. "She seems different," Evelyn remarked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Not the type of person I expected you to bring." Max didn't respond immediately. He took a moment to choose his words carefully, aware that every sentence in this conversation carried weight. "She's been through a lot," he finally said, "but she's stronger than most people I know." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a trace of something else, something unresolved. She sighed, glancing out at the garden before turning back to Max. "I'm happy for you, Max," she said. And despite the words, there was a faint tremor in her voice, as if she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Max shifted his weight, feeling the old memories stirring, but he stayed grounded in the present. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm happy for you too, Evelyn. You found what you were looking for, and that's all I ever wanted for you." Evelyn looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her lace sleeve. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Max, I never wanted things to end the way they did between us. You know that, right?" Max felt a pang of sadness, but it was more for the memory of who they had been than for the loss itself. He nodded slowly, not wanting to reopen old wounds. "I know," he said softly, "but it did, and that's okay. We've both moved on." Evelyn seemed to wrestle with his words as if trying to accept them fully. I thought we would be together forever," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "And when that didn't happen, I didn't know how to handle it." Max took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had spent so much time wondering if he could have done things differently, if he could have saved what they had. But as he looked at Evelyn now, he realized that those questions no longer held the power they once did. "I thought the same," he replied honestly. "But sometimes things don't work out the way we plan. And maybe that's okay too." Evelyn blinked, as if she hadn't expected that answer. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more, but then she simply nodded, a resigned acceptance settling into her features. She glanced towards the balcony, where Lila stood looking out at the gardens, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the setting sun. "You've changed, Max," Evelyn said quietly. "I can see it." Max smiled faintly, feeling the truth of her words. "Maybe I have," he admitted. "Or maybe I just stopped trying to be something I'm not." Evelyn studied him for a moment longer before offering a small, bittersweet smile of her own. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I really am." With that, she turned to leave, heading back towards the reception hall. Max watched her go, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't a dramatic, tearful farewell, just a quiet, mutual understanding that the past was the past, and both of them had new paths to follow. Max walked towards the balcony, where Lila stood leaning on the railing. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the gardens below. When Max approached, she turned to look at him, a question lingering in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Max nodded, a genuine smile forming on his lips. "Yeah," he replied. "I think I am." Lila studied him for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines. What did she want to talk about? She asked hesitantly. Max took a deep breath, considering how much to share. He didn't want to burden Lila with the details of his past, but he also didn't want to keep her at arm's length. She just needed to say goodbye, he said simply. To us, to what we had. Lila nodded, understanding more than he had said. She could tell that the conversation had been about more than just parting words. It had been about letting go of the past and finding the courage to move forward. I'm glad you got that chance, she said softly. Max looked at her, sensing the vulnerability in her words. He reached out and gently took her hand, offering her the same support she had given him earlier. Lila, he said quietly, I want you to know that this isn't just about helping me face the past. It's about something more. Lila's eyes widened slightly and she looked down at their joined hands. What do you mean, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max hesitated, searching for the right words. When I invited you to the wedding, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was acting on impulse. But now, I see that it was more than just a spur-of-the-moment decision. I brought you here because I care about you, and I wanted you to be part of this journey with me. Lila seemed taken aback, and Max could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She pulled her hand away gently, her expression conflicted. Max, I don't know if I can be what you need, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I'm just me. Max reached out again, his voice steady and sincere. That's all I want, Lila, he said. Just you. For a moment, Lila didn't say anything. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, any hint that this was just another fleeting moment in a life full of uncertainty. But all she saw was honesty, an openness that felt both terrifying and comforting at the same time. Okay, she finally said, her voice barely audible, but I need time, Max. I'm still figuring things out. Max smiled, relieved by her response. We've got all the time in the world, he said softly. They stood there in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them like a fragile thread. But it wasn't. The thread that threatened to break, it was one that was slowly being woven into something stronger, something that neither of them could fully understand just yet. As the evening continued, the tension that had marked the beginning of the night gradually faded away, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. Evelyn moved through the reception, surrounded by her new life and her new choices, while Max and Lila found themselves on the balcony, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a real one, and sometimes real was all that mattered. As the evening progressed, the festivities carried on inside the grand hall. Guests laughed and chatted animatedly over the clinking of glasses, the elegant melodies from the string quartet drifting through the space. Yet on the fringes of all this celebration, Lila felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't that anyone had been outright unkind to her. The guests had mostly been polite, though curious, asking her a few casual questions with veiled looks of confusion. Max had introduced her without giving much of an explanation, which seemed to only deepen their curiosity. Whispers had followed them throughout the evening. Nothing loud enough to be heard, just the barely discernible murmurs of questions left unanswered. Max, perceptive to a fault, noticed Lila's discomfort. He offered her soft reassurances and brief squeezes of her hand, gestures meant to ground her, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider in this world. A beautiful dress and styled hair couldn't erase the years of being seen as invisible or lesser by society. And now Evelyn's quiet confrontation lingered in her thoughts. Even though Evelyn hadn't been overtly hostile, Lila couldn't help but feel the unspoken judgment. She excused herself from Max's side and wandered out into the garden, where the night air was cool and the distant lights of the city twinkled in the distance. A soft breeze rustled through the meticulously trimmed hedges, and the sweet scent of roses filled the air. Lila found a secluded spot near a marble fountain, its gentle trickling creating a rhythm that momentarily calmed her nerves. She sat down on a stone bench, letting out a slow, deep breath. It had all been so overwhelming. Just days ago, she was living a life where her days blurred into each other, where people barely noticed her existence unless they were hurrying past or throwing a few coins in her direction. And now she was in a world of polished faces, sparkling gowns, and polite conversations that carried 1,000 unspoken meanings. The contrast was jarring, and it left her feeling more vulnerable than she had expected. As Lila sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Max standing a few feet away, his expression one of concern. He had noticed her absence almost immediately and had been searching for her, hoping she hadn't wandered too far. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay?" Lila forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just needed some air," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Max took a step closer, sensing that there was more beneath the surface. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Lila hesitated, her fingers tracing the cool edge of the stone bench. She didn't know how to put her feelings into words without sounding ungrateful or overly dramatic. She had spent so long trying to be strong and resilient, not letting anyone see her doubts or fears. But now, faced with Max's unwavering kindness, her defenses began to crumble. "I overheard you and Evelyn talking," she admitted quietly, not looking at him. She seemed surprised that you brought me here, and I can't blame her. I mean, look at this place. Look at the people here. And then look at me." Max frowned, moving to sit beside her on the bench. He turned to face her, searching her expression for some hint of how deeply these doubts ran. "Lila, you belong here just as much as anyone else," he said firmly. "You're not any less worthy because of where you came from or what you've been through." Lila shook her head, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "But I don't belong here, Max. I'm not like these people. They look at me and all they see is a charity case or a project. And maybe that's what I am. Maybe I'm just someone you felt sorry for, and you thought bringing me here would—" "Stop," Max interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You're not a project, Lila, and I didn't bring you here because I felt sorry for you. I brought you here because I wanted to share this experience with you, because I care about you." Lila looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You barely know me," she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. Max reached for her hand, holding it between his own. "Maybe I don't know everything about you yet," he admitted, "but what I do know is that you're kind and strong, and you've been through more than most people can imagine. And I know that I want to get to know you better, if you'll let me." Lila felt the tears slip down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by her vulnerability. She had always been so guarded, so used to hiding her emotions behind a facade of resilience. But with Max, it was different. His sincerity made it hard to keep her walls up. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you choose me, out of everyone?" Max sighed, searching for the right words. He knew that nothing he said could fully erase her doubts, but he needed her to understand how he felt. "Because you're real, Lila," he said quietly. "You're not pretending to be something you're not. And you've shown me more honesty and kindness in a few days than I've seen from most people in years." Lila took a shaky breath, trying to process what he was saying. She had spent so long being invisible to the world that she didn't know how to react to someone seeing her, truly seeing her. Max squeezed her hand gently, his voice earnest. "I don't know where this is going or what the future holds," he admitted, "but I do know that I want to be part of it, if you'll let me. Not because I want to fix you or change you, but because I think we could be good for each other." Lila stared at him, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her still held back, afraid of being hurt or let down. "What if this doesn't work out?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if I let myself hope for something more, and then it all falls apart?" Max met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "Then we'll figure it out," he replied softly. "Together." Lila felt something shift within her, a small crack in the armor she had built around her heart. For so long she had been bracing herself for disappointment, expecting life to knock her down whenever she dared to hope for something better. But here was someone who was offering her a different choice, a chance to trust, to take a leap of faith. It wasn't easy, and she wasn't sure if she could do it, but as she looked at Max, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty and resolve. "But I still need time. I'm not used to all of this." Max nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Take all the time you need," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat there in silence for a while, the sounds of the distant reception fading into the background. The garden seemed to wrap them in a cocoon of quiet, the night air cool and calming. It was a fragile moment, but one filled with possibility. A tentative first step towards something neither of them had expected. As they finally made their way back to the reception hall, Lila felt a renewed sense of clarity. The doubts were still there, lingering at the edges of her mind, but they no longer held the same power over her. She had taken a step forward, and that was enough for now. Max, walking beside her, felt a similar sense of peace. The past no longer weighed him down, and the future, uncertain as it was, felt less daunting with Lila by his side. They weren't sure where this journey would take them, but for the first time in a long time, they were both willing to find out. As they rejoined the celebration, the guests continued to mingle and chat, oblivious to the quiet transformation that had taken place in the garden. To them, it was just another evening, another party in a long string of events. But for Max and Lila, it was the beginning of something new, a chance to face the unknown together, one step at a time. As the evening drew to a close, the energy at the wedding began to shift. The boisterous conversations mellowed, and the laughter turned softer as the guests settled into a comfortable buzz from the wine and exhaustion from hours of dancing and mingling. Evelyn and her new husband, Richard, were lost in their own world, surrounded by friends and family offering congratulations and toasts. Max and Lila remained at the edges of the crowd, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid being the center of attention. They shared a silent understanding. Both had faced pivotal moments that evening, and now, as the night approached its end, there was a sense of quiet anticipation hanging between them. As Max turned his gaze away from the crowd, he caught sight of Lila's profile. She was watching the wedding party with a faraway look in her eyes, her fingers absent-mindedly grazing the edge of her champagne flute. He noticed the way her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were wrestling with an unspoken question or lingering thought. Max leaned closer, lowering his voice so as not to disturb her thoughts abruptly. "Lila," he said softly, "do you want to get out of here?" Lila blinked, turning to look at him. For a moment she hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the reception hall where the bride and groom were still basking in the glow of their celebration. She could feel the exhaustion settling into her bones, not just from the evening, but from the whirlwind of emotions and revelations she had faced. "Yes," she replied quietly, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. "I think I'm ready to go." Max offered her a gentle smile and extended his arm. She looped her arm through his, and together they made their way towards the exit. A few guests glanced their way, but most were too wrapped up in their own conversations to pay much attention. It was almost as if Max and Lila were slipping away unnoticed, stepping out of the past and into the possibilities of a new beginning. They walked through the grand hallway of the estate, their footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet. The air felt different now, cooler, fresher, as they left the warmth of the reception hall behind. Outside, the gardens were bathed in moonlight, the soft glow giving the landscape an ethereal quality. Max led Lila towards a small, wrought iron gate at the far end of the garden. Beyond it lay a narrow path that wound through a grove of tall, ancient trees. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, their whispers carrying a sense of calm and promise. Lila glanced back at the estate, seeing the warm lights and hearing the distant sounds of music and laughter. It was a beautiful, glittering world, but she no longer felt the same weight of inadequacy or isolation that had gripped her earlier in the evening. Instead, she felt a quiet acceptance of herself, of the night, and of whatever lay ahead. "Where does this path lead?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not entirely sure," Max admitted with a chuckle, "but I figured we could find out together." Lila smiled at his response. There was something reassuring about his openness, his willingness to embrace the unknown without needing all the answers. It was a quality she hadn't encountered often, and it made her feel less alone in her own uncertainties. They continued down the path, walking side by side in comfortable silence. The moonlight filtered through the branches overhead, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Max reached out to steady Lila as they navigated a few uneven stones, his touch light and reassuring. It wasn't an act of chivalry, but rather an instinctive gesture of care, and Lila found herself appreciating it more than she expected. As they reached a small clearing, Max stopped and turned to face her. "Lila," he said softly, his expression earnest. "I know tonight was overwhelming for you, and I appreciate you sticking with me through it all. But I want to make sure you know that you're not obligated to stay in this, whatever this is, if you don't want to." Lila looked up at him, taken aback by his words. He was giving her an out, offering her the freedom to walk away without any strings attached. And yet, as she stood there in the moonlit clearing, she realized that she didn't want to leave. Not yet. "Why do you keep giving me choices?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Most people just assume they know what's best for me, or they try to fix me without asking if that's what I want." Max smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. "Because I've made that mistake before," he admitted. "With Evelyn, I thought I knew what she needed, and I didn't listen when she tried to tell me otherwise. I don't want to make that mistake with you." Lila felt a pang of understanding. She could see that Max was trying to learn from his past, just as she was trying to reconcile hers. They were both flawed, both carrying their own scars and regrets. But in this moment, those imperfections felt like something they could share rather than hide. "Thank you," she said softly, the sincerity of her words carrying more weight than she could fully express. Max's smile widened, the tension in his shoulders easing. He turned to look out at the trees, the moonlight casting a silver sheen on the leaves. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier," he continued, his voice thoughtful, "about feeling like you don't belong in that world. And I just wanted to say, you don't have to belong to that world if you don't want to. You can belong to whatever world you choose." Lila was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. She had spent so long being defined by her circumstances, by the labels and judgments others placed on her, that the idea of choosing her own world felt almost radical. It was a freedom she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "What if I don't know where I belong?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Max turned back to face her, his expression gentle. "Then maybe we can figure it out together," he replied. "One step at a time." Lila felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a grand, sweeping epiphany. It was a quiet, steady realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to navigate this journey alone. They stood there for a while longer, neither of them feeling the need to fill the silence with empty words. It was a moment of quiet companionship, a shared understanding that didn't require explanations or promises. They were both searching, both learning, and for the first time in a long time, they were willing to face the unknown with someone else by their side. When they finally turned to leave the clearing, the path back seemed less daunting, less fraught with uncertainty. The moonlight guided their steps, and the cool night air felt like a gentle reminder that even in the darkest of times there was still light to be found. As they reached the gate and stepped back into the gardens, the sounds of the reception hall grew louder, but they no longer felt overwhelming. Max glanced at Lila, and she met his gaze with a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. "Do you want to stay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lila shook her head, her decision firm. "No," she replied. "I think it's time to go." Max nodded, understanding her choice. He offered her his arm once more, and together they made their way towards the waiting car. The journey back to the city was quiet, the night passing by in a blur of streetlights and shadows. But the silence was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was a comfortable, shared space where both of them could breathe. When they finally arrived at Lila's shelter, she turned to Max, feeling a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. She didn't know what the future held or how long this connection between them would last, but she was willing to find out, and that, she realized, was more than enough for now. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady, "for everything." Max smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you, Lila," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity, "for being part of this journey with me." They exchanged one last look, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. And as Lila stepped out of the car and watched Max drive away, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. A feeling that, despite all the uncertainties and fears, she was exactly where she needed to be. The city streets were quiet as Lila made her way back to the shelter, her footsteps echoing softly in the night. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable challenge. It felt like a path she could walk, one step at a time, with someone by her side who believed in her potential to belong somewhere, to someone, and perhaps even to herself. As she reached the shelter's door, Lila took one last look at the city around her, feeling a sense of quiet hope that had once seemed impossible. The world was still vast and daunting, but it no longer felt insurmountable. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt ready to face it.